Hi, I'm the director for our New Zealand registered not-for-profit charitable trust called Common Knowledge. And it's a charitable trust that's been around since the 1990s. We focus on a number of things, but one branch is the branch that holds birthing better childbirth skills that hundreds of mums and dads developed with me in the early 1970s, along with a concept that goes like this. It's normal and natural when you're pregnant to self-learn birth and birth coaching skills and then use those skills to work through the activity of birthing your baby, no matter where the birth occurs, no matter who's present, no matter your circumstances or beliefs, no matter your choices or lack of choices or change of choices, and no matter what happens to you around you at your birth. Birthing Better families firmly believe in certain realities. We get pregnant to have a baby, not a type of birth. It's an activity 100% of pregnant women are going to do one way or another, and it's an activity. And so therefore, we should have a good set of skills. Now, I've lived through 3 evidence-based practices, maternity practices. And when my generation gave birth in 1970, the first childbirth classes were being taught, and they were all skills-based, which meant in the United States, for a generation, multiple millions of mothers and fathers used birth and birth coaching skills. So when we told our birth stories, it was focused mostly on the skills we used. 95% of us labored back then because cesareans were such major abdominal surgery. And when we labored, some of us labored for hours or days. Many of us, most of us had risks. Most risks didn't become problems, and most problems didn't become tragedies. Many of us suffered because we didn't have skills to deal with the natural occurring pain of labor, and the Lamaze and Bradley skills used didn't adjust well and didn't adapt well. And they were focused on low-risk women having a natural birth and a pain-free labor with no medical care, which left many of us out. But we tried. And so when we told our birth stories, we told birth stories about the fact that our breathing worked for us, or didn't breathing work for us, or our husbands really helped us, or they timed the contractions, or they helped us relax. But then by the 1980s, the whole childbirth conversation changed. First, it became global. And second, it became really a separation of natural birth versus medical birth, obstetricians versus midwives, home versus hospital. Instead of having assessments, monitored procedures, now they were all interventions, and they were, of course, imposed on women and unnecessary. Childbirth classes shifted from skills totally to information so that you could create a birth plan. And birth stories changed. And in the description below, you'll see what they changed to. So almost every birth story I hear, and our trust holds tens of thousands of them, is time. I got in the car to go to the hospital at 7 in the morning, or I was starting to feel contractions Thursday evening, or my labor didn't really pick up until Sunday morning. We all know that element. It just rolls out of our mouth really easily. We view our birth in terms of a time frame, which, by the way, should give us a hint that it's an activity that we're doing. And if we could fill that activity with using skills, we'd all birth better. But nobody's telling us to. I've started to come out more since COVID came on because I've spent 50 years trying to say the same thing. But the people who are messaging childbirth are primarily the smallest group, which is those advocating for natural birth. But they're loud and they're vocal, and they have consumed the ethosphere around childbirth. And it has caused the rise of the shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, anger that women have because they're making birth plans, assuming that their birth professionals will give them the birth they want. So this one element about time, actually, that's always been there. Women have always talked about their birth stories in terms of when this activity took place. Over what time did it take place? And that's important. This is an activity that takes place over time. If we're getting into the car, we're having surgery, it takes time. We have to do this activity. So the second element is what they did and didn't do. Now, what's interesting is this has changed in my generation. My generation, we didn't talk too much. We just accepted, right or wrong, good or bad, that we were the generation that had access to modern medicine well beyond the generation that occurred before that, or the generations that occurred before that, or globally around the world where there's no medical care. And so we accepted the assessments, monitoring, and procedures because we felt that those safeguarded the health and well-being of our baby. But it also came with a belief that they should somehow be treating us in a way that we liked. And sometimes they did, and we would comment on it. Not so much in my generation, but since the 80s. In my generation, what we commented on was the fact that our husbands were now permitted to be with us in labor at least, and then in cesareans as well. And they were helping us. Instead of being left alone, we now had somebody to help us. And so my generation praised our husbands. They helped us. They breathed with us. They timed the contractions. They helped us to relax. They were there with us. We shared this experience with them. But then in the 80s, when skills were put aside by the natural birth movement and said cows and cats aren't taught to birth, women don't need to. So all the classes shifted to information. Fathers were reduced from being coaches. You shouldn't tell a woman what to do. Leave her alone to discover birth. You should just support her choices. So fathers now don't know what to do. And now, because we're making birth plans and we're saying to our care providers, we want this and we don't want that, we want to be involved in informed consent, there's an expectation that people treat us in a respect that we define. And so we have lots of birth stories that have this element. And it can be like, the labor and delivery nurses did a rough internal on me. I was really pissed. Or the labor and delivery nurse were very gentle when they did an internal with me. I was so grateful. Or my husband was useless. Or my husband tried to help me, and he was there. Or I wanted all of these things, and they wouldn't let me have them. They demanded something else. Or they were very supportive of my choices. I was so grateful. So you've heard this element in birth stories. You hear that all the time. And the third element is what I felt. I had terrible back labor for hours, or I pushed for hours, or my birth was so fast, or I wanted to change positions. And when I changed positions, I could feel my contractions went off and weren't as strong. So those are the three elements: time, when it happened, what they did or didn't do, and what I felt. But there's this element now missing, which is what you did. So during that time, what did you do? How did you focus on your breathing? How did you relax? If you labored, how did you determine what positions were causing you to have an effective labor or stalling in your labor? What did you do during that time? What did your husband or partner do during that time? What did you do? How did you cope? How did you manage? How did you work through the activity? How did you deal with the activity or what people were doing to and around you, or the sensations you were having? How did you handle those things? What did you do? How did you act? How did you behave? What did people around you see? So the natural birth movement says women should behave any way they want. Well, okay. So when women are screaming, what are women saying to those around them? I'm unhappy. When women are moaning, what are they saying to people around them? I'm stressed. I'm overwhelmed. Women don't want to be saved. They just want to have a dignified, positive birth after they have a safe one. But what did you do? When they were doing things to you that you didn't like, what did you do? When you were having a rough internal, how did you breathe? How did you relax? What did you do? When you were having a great birth, you were doing things to help yourself. You were focused on your breathing. You were focused on relaxing. What did they or didn't do? How can your husband know how to help you if he's been told not to? So we need to think about these things, because we either have a concept around childbirth, as our trust is advocating, that everyone should self-learn birth and birth coaching skills in pregnancy and use those skills to work through the activity of birthing your baby, or we're going to continue to do what we're doing now, which is focus on women's choices, believing that you can plan a birth when babies do not come to plan, and there is no way to know what your birth's going to be like. You have to do that activity. So what skills are you learning in pregnancy to do that activity? And how committed are you to using those skills? Because they, out there, are going to do things whether you like them or not. And you have the ability to either react or respond. And if you have skills, you'll respond. You'll take charge of your own behavior, your own ability to cope and manage. You don't have to like it, but you still have to do it. So the third element, what I felt. And this is where Birthing Better skills developed, because we could not control what they or they didn't do. We couldn't control the time. We could control us, and we could begin to control the physical sensations that we had. Birth has always been divided in two things: women suffering in childbirth and risks. The Lamaze and the Bradley of the 60s and 70s, 90% reduced the suffering. But that wasn't the focus of Lamaze and Bradley or the natural childbirth movement at the time. They were focused on low-risk women, ignoring the fact that 100% of pregnant women will give birth. And they only wanted low-risk women to have a natural birth, pain-free labor with no medical interventions. They ignored the suffering that most of us felt because we lacked skills. And they didn't really pay attention to the risks and how we could do it. So what we felt, as the third element of the birth stories, is I had terrible back labor. Well, could we do anything about that? Well, it turns out that we could. Or I had terrible pain in my hip. Or my labor was very, very slow. Or I vomited throughout early labor. Or nothing I did got my labor going. Or my baby got stuck. Or I didn't dilate. This is what I felt, right? And that's where Birthing Better families, when we developed the skills, focused on. We focused on the feelings that we were having, the sensations. So in Birthing Better, for instance, we often heard women, and this is in element 3, my labor contractions weren't very painful at first. That's what I felt, right? Then they got more painful. That's what I felt. Then they got more painful, and I wasn't able to cope so well. That's what I felt, and that's what I did. I couldn't cope. Then my labor contractions got really intense. That's what I felt, and I began to lose it. It tells you that woman lacks skills. Then my contractions got over the top, and I demanded an epidural, or I chose an epidural. Why did you choose an epidural? And epidurals aren't wrong or right. Our trust doesn't have anything to say about it. But why are you choosing one? Because you lack the skills to cope. So we need to grow a skilled birthing population, not to reduce the use of epidurals. If they reduce, it reduces because we cope in our birth. And we feel we can cope and manage and feel in control. That's what reduces the use of epidurals. Is we manage pain. Can we manage labor pains? Of course we can. But we need skills. Is birth instinctive? It happens. Does that make it instinctive? That's just a physiological thing. But we're doing the activity. So if we have skills, we can birth better with the skills we have. So go through these things in your birth stories. How are you telling your birth stories? And if you use skills, include them the next time you tell them. And ask yourself, what's the priority when I'm telling these birth stories? Am I telling the priority of time? Oh, I labored for 72 hours, and you tell the time frame of that labor? Or what they didn't do or didn't do to me, because that's leaving the shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, anger, and frustration so many women have, because we've been told we should expect to get the birth we want. And that's nonsense. Babies do not come to plan. You do not know what your birth is going to be like. It's going to unfold as an activity you have to do. What you felt and didn't feel, that's a big issue, because without a skilled birthing population, that does not change. With a skilled birthing population, it does change. I had terrible back labor, so I started to mobilize my sacrum, and that really helped. Or I breathed inside my bony pelvis, and I could feel it expand, and I softened with every exhale, and I could feel that helped. And I could feel that back pain began to move down, so I knew my baby was moving down. I birthed really, really quickly. It was really traumatic. Without skills, you just feel you're going to die. But with skills, I was really able to focus every inhale, every exhale. I knew exactly which positions I could actually slow the labor down just a little bit to give myself time to rest. I pushed for hours. Said another way, my partner and I did the internal work 5 minutes a day for 8 weeks. I could feel my vagina just open up to my baby. My baby came out in just a few contractions. My vagina recovered really, really, really quickly. So, what are we left with? We are left with this missing element. And this missing element has been caused by the messages that women give to each other. And if I get heard for nothing else, it's for that. Because as a woman, when I gave birth in 1970, I used Lamaze. And I can honestly tell you, it didn't work great for me. My labor was induced, and my Lamaze teacher then informed me after the birth, it doesn't work for inductions. To which, in my mind, simple mind, was, how can you have skills for childbirth that do not work for every birth? 100% of pregnant women will give birth one way or another. We as women should want to elevate this one-off activity that's infrequent, that we cannot replay, that leaves birth memories forever, and that is so important in our life, from moving from an adult into being a parent, that we do not elevate this activity as something that we should have skills for. It's shameful, absolutely shameful. And the natural birth movement has been responsible for this message. And I have been cranky about that element. That element, not about the natural birth movement. If you want to give birth without any assessments, monitoring procedures, go for it. Many Birthing Better families did. Other Birthing Better families wanted everything done to them. Who cares? Do you really care how someone else births their baby? Do you care how I birthed mine? Probably not. Do you really have any interest in my birth story? Probably not. But my birth story matters to me. And your birth story matters to you. And if you have skills to birth your baby, you will remember that activity as something you did rather than something that just happened to you. Now, I've had people say to me, you're guilt tripping all of us who didn't have skills. No, nobody told you. In fact, women have told you the opposite through the message of the natural birth movement. Now, let me talk to you about the men in birth, the birth professionals, the obstetricians most likely. Okay, they want you to have a safe birth. We know that. And they believe that assessments, monitoring, and procedures are both their moral responsibility, their professional responsibility, their guidelines to practice, the evidence-based practice, the standards of care. That's what they do. And if you're living in a country like the US, then you're dealing with an insurance company. However, it is your birth. You cannot change the system between now and when you give birth. So if you do not want any medical assessments, do not go to an obstetrician or go to a hospital. And if you think that having a home birth with a midwife is not going to involve medical assessments, you're inaccurate. You may tolerate them because you're at home and think that they're not being done, but they are being done. They are being done because modern midwifery and direct entry midwives all have a standard of practice and guidelines to practice. So midwives listen to babies' heartbeats. Midwives will do internals. Midwives will even do a sweep of your membranes or rupture your membranes. They do lots of medical assessments, monitoring procedures. But we attribute the negative ones to the male obstetricians. That's insane. That male obstetrician could be your husband or your brother or your son, your father. Okay? And what you need to know is all of them, whether they're male obstetricians or female obstetricians, they no longer work with skilled families. And they would love to. So it's your responsibility to become skilled. It's your responsibility to tell them that you're learning skills. It's your responsibility to get them to put your skills in your notes from 24 weeks on. And it's your responsibility to tell them that if you look like you're behaving and coping well and staying on top of it, to praise you. And it's your responsibility to tell them that if you looked overwhelmed, to refer to your notes and encourage you to use the skills, because this is your baby's birth. You want that element in your birth story. You want to spend the rest of your life remembering the dignity you felt as you use skills to birth your baby. Does that mean you have to use skills perfectly? No. Why? If you have a child or if you're an adult and you're sitting down to play a piano, every time you play the piano, do you have to be perfect? No. You're using your skills. And every time you're using your skills, you're evaluating. Childbirth is a time frame. We get lots of moments in that time frame, moment to moment to moment, to evaluate how we're using our skills, how to adapt them, how to adjust them, which ones to use, if we have a skills-based method that is geared on the ability to adjust and modify how we're using our skills and has a broad range of them. Lamaze and Bradley didn't have that. Hypnobirthing doesn't. Calm birth does not. Birthing within does not. Partly because they're focused on low-risk natural births with the assumption that the only thing you really need is good breathing skills. But let's go back to what I felt is the third element. And what Birthing Better fathers really understood, because there were so few cesareans when I gave birth in 1970, when Birthing Better started to develop. For the first 10 years, we just focused on skills that we could cope better with natural occurring labor pains. And we discovered that many of us still had a longer second stage. And as cesareans became safer, and I do have to tell you, although I've mentioned this in a lot of other ones, how did cesareans move from a classical cesarean to the bikini cut or the low-line incision? It's because my generation of women started to wear bikinis, and we didn't want to be left with that ugly scar. And we wanted husbands to be with us, so we didn't want to be knocked out. So the medical profession responded to demands from consumers, and they developed the bikini cut. They didn't do it out of the goodness of their heart. We put pressure on them. And we wanted to be awake. So they came up with spinals and then epidurals. We demanded that. And then we demanded that our breech babies that were at risk from laboring, our twins that are at risk in laboring, weren't put at risk. So we were willing to have more cesareans. So when we discovered that the longer first and second stages then got more medical care, because nobody wants a woman to suffer. Nobody wants a baby to get tired and get stressed because it's having trouble getting out of the woman's body. Then we focus birthing better attention on how to prepare our body for birth. And we noticed that 24 weeks was the best time to start to do that, and 32 weeks to start to do the internal work. Because what dads understood from seeing birth from the outside, this is just a big object that's in a container, and that the object has to open up that container and come down through and out. And there's got to be some mechanical, practical, hands-on, effective ways to do that. And yes, there is. Right? We can do a hip lift. We can open the hips sideways. We can do a sit bone spread and lengthen the muscles that are controlling the sacrum and the back part of our vagina. We can use our breathing to inhale and expand inside our pelvis and exhale and soften inside it. We can develop teamwork skills so our husband knows when we don't want to be touched or when we do want to be touched and where. We can develop skills that cue us by touch how to soften inside. We can learn and have learned not just these positions are right, because those positions aren't always right for our baby, but which positions in our labor are the ones that keep our labor progressive and keep our cervix dilating and keep our baby happy so that our baby can stimulate our body to come down through our body easily. We learned those things. So as a trust, am I just advocating birthing better skills? No, we have a concept. What's the concept? Just repeat after me. It's an easy one. When you're pregnant, self-learn birth and birth coaching skills, and then use the skills to work through the activity of birthing your baby. It's your baby. Do the activity with skills. Be empowered. Empowerment can no longer come and should never have come from this belief that you have this natural birth, preferably now at home, in water, being left alone. Some women, that's great, and on YouTube, those are the ones we see. Or we'll see the final delivery of a baby, which takes this amount of the birth, which takes that amount. We don't see that. And we accept women moaning, groaning. But when you read birth stories on Facebook now in groups, so many women are just heading to an epidural. Why? Because they see contractions as either painful or not painful. Whereas now birthing better families, fathers saw that there were 5 phases of every contraction. They start, they get more intense, they peak, they begin to ease away, they go away. So we could apply skills to those 5 phases without just seeing them as a blump in which they were either painful or not painful, and we either coped or we didn't cope. We now know that even in a painful contraction, we can set our skills at the beginning. We can use our skills as the intensity goes up. We lose it for the 10 or 15 seconds at the top, but we gain control again. We feel in control, we handle, we manage as it eases off, and we manage during that period of time in between. The epidural does, it just numbs us for all of that. We're not working. It's not wrong to have an epidural. It's just that we are using them for something that if we had skills, we just use them less. The same way as if we had skills, we wouldn't be so afraid of the process of labor and delivery. We wouldn't be afraid of damaging our vaginas because we would have prepared them. We wouldn't have been afraid of our twins or our breeches coming down because we'd be able to create more space for them. So when you think about birth stories, think about how you want to tell your birth story to your children. Do you want to tell them this? You were my cesarean. Your sister was my home birth. Or do you want to say this? I focused on my breathing throughout the whole time of your birth. And your dad and I worked together so beautifully. It was hard work, but I knew just where to soften inside. And you can say that for your cesarean or your home birth. What do you want to tell your children? And that's why our trust is now speaking up. Because we are now, since the 80s, how many years is that? Generation and a half away from this belief that you can just make a birth plan, choose your birth. Or that a cesarean somehow is not a real birth. And it's so curious to hear women in the VBAC groups get numbed, but it's important for them to have the vaginal part of it. I don't know. I just know that the thousands and thousands of birthing better birth stories where we used our skills to birth our babies made the difference in our dignity and our empowerment, our memories. And we want that for you. So that's my little blurb on birth stories. Include that fourth element. And if you've already had a birth in which you have 3 elements, go back and see, did you have that fourth element at all? And if you did, tell that element. Include it. And if you didn't, and you're going to get pregnant again, learn some skills. And if you didn't, and you're not going to be pregnant again, imagine how you would have used skills had you learned them. We can't go back. We did the best we could then. If we didn't know then, we did the best we could. And when we know better, we do better. Maya Angelou. It's a bastardization of what she said. So we have a human mind, which means if you lacked skills, you can go back and put skills into your past births and replay them. We can do that. So you need to understand the importance of skills in childbirth. I've had people say to me over the years, you know, childbirth is just this physiological thing. There's no equivalent to that in our life. And so I had to think, 50 years gives me a long time to think about anything. How about sex? So let's look at sex. If you learn skills to be a good lover and you use those skills, do you have a better experience? Sure you do. If you're hungry, do you just go gnaw on a tree out in your front yard? No. You learn what's safe, first of all, what you can put in your mouth. And then if you've got a brain in your head, you learn how to cook. So physiological things, sex and hunger, are connected to skills if we have the desire to learn them and if we use them. Birth. What if we had a natural hunger movement, natural sex movement that said, you'll know what to do? How would we be doing with those two things? Not well, but that's what it's been like about birth. Just, it's a no-brainer. And as women, we diminish each other by doing this. And I cannot stress it enough. Our trust is located in New Zealand. We have the most wonderful midwifery model of care. It's a partnership that is wonderful. Women love having continuity care midwives. Absolutely love it. And it advocated for everybody, absolutely everyone. And it has this huge fault in it. It's based on a partnership. And it's based on a slogan. And that slogan of the midwifery model in New Zealand is that pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events that rarely require medical care. We haven't defined the word normal in that sentence, so we're assuming that normal means good and healthy and good outcome and that women can cope. That's not really what normal means. It means anything that might happen could happen. But let's just go with that as a sentence that it's a nothing burger. then why do midwives in New Zealand believe they need to go to school for 4 years? That makes no sense. Why do they believe they should give 24/7 care to women in New Zealand if it's a nothing burger? That makes no sense. So if those two things make no sense, then why do they not advocate for their partners to self-learn birth and birth coaching skills? They just say, what do you want and what do you expect of me? So what does that do? Midwives are bloody exhausted in New Zealand. The cesarean rate has doubled. It's as high as it is in an obstetric-led country. So how do we change this? If the goal is to reduce cesareans or to reduce interventions, don't you think that the goal should include a high emphasis on a message as a birth professional to your clients that it's going to be an activity you're going to do, and here's a handout of all the skills-based methods. Please choose one or more of them, and at 24 weeks, we're going to mark your skills in your notes, and if you're doing well in your birth, we're going to pat you on the back and say, well done, guys. And if you look overwhelmed, we can look in your notes. You learned breathing. I said I did, but I didn't. Okay, then you have to deal with that. But if you did, and you think, well, shouldn't really be using that now because I'm having more intervention. No, your baby's birth. I shouldn't be using it. No, your baby's birth. So we need to understand, all birth professionals, you need to tell your clients that they should become skilled to birth their babies, because this is an activity each of us is going to do. And I want to tell you, when you're a birth professional, you'd prefer to work with skilled families. You need to tell them to become skilled. Just simple as that. You're a doula, tell them to become skilled. You're a midwife, tell them to become skilled. You're an obstetrician, tell them to become skilled. Because when we start to work with skilled families, it changes something. And we know that because labor and delivery nurses and obstetricians in the U.S. worked with people taking Lamaze and Bradley method. And those assessments and monitoring procedures that I had were relaxed because they saw multiple millions of women making some effort to learn skills that got shut down by the natural birth movement in the 80s rather than evolving together. So now we're going to try to evolve them together, and it's your responsibility to pass on this message because I can't do it alone. So how can you help? Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Tell your friends. Pass on these. Make comments. Help us know what skills you used, why they worked, why they didn't work. It's important to know these things because you have to tell your children, and they have to tell their children. We create the future in our present. And that's your birth story. So see you later. Talk to you again. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening.